Well, I see you made your way back here. Welcome. And for today, I'm going to tell you to just go ahead and buckle up because we're tackling one of my favorite topics. No, it's my favorite topic, and that's generational dysfunction. Now, the title will say generational curses because that's the common term, but I can't get down with that term, because it leads to such disempowering outcomes. Okay. When people talk about generational curses, and including the disappointing way in which I find the American Christian church handles it, and I'm allowed to be a bit of a critic because I am a Christian, but you won't find any religious answers here. So stick around if you're not a Christian, because the way I hear the Christian church and Christians in general as a body and people in general talk about generational curses is so disempowering that it's frustrating. Because when you say the word curse, people talk about it like there's this spirit floating around out there in the sky that has taken aim at your bloodline and doing damage against everyone's will. And today I want to talk about the anatomy of a generational curse, just some of my early thoughts on it, because I'm going to be breaking this down for a long time. But some of my early thoughts on the anatomy of a generational curse, and it has nothing to do with the disempowering idea that there's something out there causing you turmoil, causing your bloodline turmoil. I call this thing generational dysfunction because it's essentially what happens when grown-ass adults pass down thought patterns, beliefs, experiences to their children that just produce the same dysfunctional results as those children get older, live it out, and pass it to their children. See, when you call it a curse, it becomes very disempowering because you hear people say things like, "Oh God, remove this curse from my family." When in reality, if you call it dysfunction, you begin to understand that there are human beings making choices in this pattern. So then there are some very actionable things that you can do to interrupt the pattern. It's not about you being subject to some mystical force that's causing your life to be in chaos. So I was sitting in my room one day, and I have a hand recorder that you can use out in the field to do interviews and things like that. And because my best podcast ideas come when I'm not sitting in my podcast quote unquote studio, I said, I need to start keeping this recorder with me so when I think of something, I can grab it and start talking. And that's what happened. So what you're about to hear for today's episode is what happened when my thoughts were on what is the actual anatomy of a generational curse, that you may call it, and generational dysfunction, which I call it. What is the anatomy of that thing? Can we start digging down to the root? Because if my life is about helping people understand that there are very actionable things that they can do to heal from this thing and to interrupt this thing. If that's the case, we really have to talk about the anatomy of it, right? You have to understand what's at the foundational root of it to start taking those actionable steps. And that's where my thoughts went on this particular day. This was a few weeks ago. So what I'm going to do is, after I stop talking here, I'm going to play the audio, just the raw audio for you, of my early thoughts on the anatomy of generational dysfunction. And you know me, I love a good conversation. Take a moment, reach out to me. If you're catching this on social media, feel free to leave comments. But if you come into my space, be respectful, because I respect all positions and opinions. But if you come in acting a fool, you're either going to get your feelings hurt or you're going to be dismissed. Okay? So come in correctly. Enjoy this episode. Talk to me about your experiences with this in your family. Talk to me about how you've healed this. Let me know if you have any aha moments. And we're going to keep going back to this topic as I continue my personal ministry of helping people heal through this topic. All right, y'all. Can we talk about the anatomy of generational curses for a minute? And I'm not talking about the mystical version of this thing, where people have their eye on this spiritual warfare that's occurring out there in the cosmos somewhere, that's influencing the events that are occurring in their family. It's not that I have anything against spiritual definitions of generational curses, but I do find them to be terribly disempowering. When I listen to people say prayers about generational curses, it's like, Lord, lift this curse from my family. And they're literally trying to pray this thing away. So that's why you pretty much won't catch me calling it a generational curse at all, except to introduce the subject matter. It's generational dysfunction. Let's call it what it is. And calling it that also is very empowering, because you start understanding that there are a lot of choices made along the way. Actively, some subconsciously, but a lot of them actively being made along the way. And it leaves room for you to be real intentional and actionable about what you do about it. Now, I recently made a post to social media about the times where generational dysfunction cannot always be healed. And it's important to talk about the anatomy of the thing, because I don't feel as if there are enough conversations about that aspect of generational dysfunction. And it's like, you know, sometimes we think of generational dysfunction as one generation just intentionally harming the next generation, and they grow up to intentionally harm the next generation, and so on and so forth. That's not it. Just from my observation and just from my experience on both sides of this, there are a whole lot of folks who had no intent of harming anyone. I say it all the time. Most people see themselves as a victim of what's happening in their families. And I always say, if everybody's a victim, where are all the perpetrators? You have to start recognizing that there's something unintentional at work here if everyone believes they're a victim. I mean, think about a car accident. Someone can chase you down and rear-end your car on purpose. Or, as the term accident implies, they can accidentally run into the back of your car. But guess what? Whether it was intentional or unintentional, the price to repair it is the same. The damage is the same. That's the anatomy of generational dysfunction. It's passed down unintentionally by people who have felt victimized by the patterns in their families, and then came to not recognize the moment at which they also became perpetrators. That's the anatomy of the thing. It was so normalized that people who looked around at the generations before them, their parents, their grandparents, and said, these folks are nuts. This is not, how am I a part of this family? No, ma'am, absolutely not. And then one day found themselves the villain in the next generation's story. Completely inadvertently, because they had become so conditioned to operate in the madness, they didn't see at which point they stopped being actual victims of the thing, quote unquote, and became the perpetrators in the thing, all inadvertently. No one woke up in the morning and said, you know what? I really want to be a part of this madness that's going on in my family. I really want to pass this to my kids. You know what? I really want to see what this thing looks like when it plays out. I want to cause as much damage as possible. Nobody woke up in the damn morning and said that. But it happened. It happened anyway. That's the anatomy of a thing. That's the anatomy of generational dysfunction. If you want to talk about generational curses, we're talking about people who have been so conditioned to operate in the madness that they didn't see to the point at which they became the madness. I've lived on both sides of this. I can raise my hand and say this is truth, because one of the things I notice, if I ever post about being a victim, and I don't use that word, but if my post is centered around how to heal from things that were done to you, folks are fine with that. But any time at which I post something that talks about your personal accountability, when it's your children who have their turn at talking about the madness, folks get real weird then. They get real weird. Screw them kids. They wrong. I didn't do that. I can raise my hand and say I was absolutely a part of the madness. When my kids were young, the dysfunction I came from was such a normal part of who I was. I really had no self-awareness at all. I saw myself as suffering at the hand of a pattern that I was surrounded by, and I had no idea that I had just joined the circus. I was in there doing the circus thing. I was a clown in that circus, straight up monkey. I didn't realize that. So many of those realizations didn't happen until later. And it was about 13 years ago when I said, oh no, ma'am, this doesn't even feel right. There is just a moment at which, if you're fortunate, the awareness hits you. And that's exactly my experience. And I'm going to tell you what. And I'm going to be very honest with this. Even though I have close relationships with both of my sons, one of them still struggles. One of them still struggles with me. Because the role that I had in the madness, inadvertently. I feel like I've been on what I call the apology tour for 13 years, for sure. And every breach can't be mended. It doesn't matter if you do everything you're supposed to do to heal. It doesn't matter if you do everything you should do to apologize and show up in completely different ways. This is the anatomy of the thing. This is how it becomes generational. One, because there's all victims and no perpetrators, right? People don't see the point at which they jumped over the broom, jumped over the line from being a quote unquote victim into being someone who's just a part of the circus. And then on the other end of that, the folks who feel they were harmed aren't appropriately approaching their healing with intent. So they're setting themselves up to simply bleed on the next generation, should there be one. That's the anatomy of the thing. This is how it runs rampant and gets out of control. And it's time we get honest about that. And the quickest way to do that is, if you came from dysfunction, you literally have to assume there is a way in which that dysfunction is playing out in the way you see and approach life. Because there's no such thing as an impressionable child. Because remember, your brain is a sponge between the ages of 0 and 7. When you're still in those single-digit ages, you are soaking it all in. You are in the true becoming. Your brain is getting wired to fire a certain way. It's setting you up cognitively. And if you were raised in dysfunction, you have to just assume, baby, that dysfunction is a part of who you are. And that if you don't heal intentionally and start pulling back curtains and opening doors and looking in the dark corners, and checking your blind spots and recruiting others such as therapists and coaches to help you do that, you have to assume you are just setting yourself to become a clown in that circus. Because trust me, I've been in the circus, baby. The madness all hiding there in plain sight, but I couldn't see it. That's the anatomy of the thing. That is the anatomy of the thing. And crucial. Because sometimes you find out too late. Sometimes you realize way too late. I don't believe that's my story. But listen, only life will tell. The time of life will tell. But if you come from the dysfunction, you just literally have to assume that it is a part of your cognitive functioning and that there is a healing, that you are like those who came before you. Because you may not feel like you are. I certainly didn't feel like I was. I was sad about where I came from. But I had no awareness of how I had become a product of it. And sorry if you're getting a lot of background noise, but I'm using a recorder right now because I'm chilling. I am straight chilling. I'm not sitting at my little podcast setup. I'm literally chilling in my room with a hand recorder, hoping to edit this and post it at another time. Because I see people struggling with this. People who haven't come to the place yet where they recognize themselves as a part of the pattern and not even understanding why their adult children have a problem with them. You know, I've actually seen someone say, you know, my parents and my grandparents drank. They were alcoholics. Said it like it was a bad thing. And then in the next breath said, you know, I like to have a cocktail. I like a good cocktail. Sometimes I have too much, but never used the word alcoholic to describe themselves. They don't see the same that's going on. So you mean to tell me they were alcoholics that created a challenging life for you, but you're not an alcoholic who created a challenging environment for your children? I've said this before. Sometimes you just have a more convenient excuse. You're doing the same thing that occurred before you, but you just have a more convenient excuse for why you do it. And you don't even see, you're not even perceiving that you've just become a part of that machinery and doing the same thing because you still feel like a victim of the generations before you and don't recognize how you've crossed the line into being a quote unquote perpetrator of the same, because you're bleeding all over the next generation and they're having a very similar experience of you. And it takes courage, because I have my hand in the air right now. I raised my hand. It takes a lot of courage to say, yup, there was a time in my life when that was me. And it takes even more courage, because I'm going to put my hand down now. It takes even more courage to raise your hand and say, and it's me right now. You're hearing the sound of my voice, and it's the first time that you've had an opportunity to consider that the anatomy of generational dysfunction, it got you. You didn't stop to consider how your experience of life may be bleeding things onto the next generation that you didn't intend. And simply haven't considered it up until this point. That's the anatomy of generational dysfunction. And by calling it generational dysfunction, we're giving ourselves things that we can do with intent. We're giving ourselves actionable ways to reverse it and heal it. Even if it means no one else follows you, it can still stop with you just by virtue of you becoming aware and healing through your part. Sometimes someone else in the family just needs to know what it looks like when someone approaches individual healing. You can't take everybody with you because you're not responsible for everyone else's mental health. You're not responsible for how they choose to walk through life. You're not responsible. And in fact, if you start out trying to save everybody, that's a perfect recipe for nobody to make it. Trust me. Trust me. Because healing generational dysfunction is a thing where you literally can only save yourself. And that's true of everyone that's in that bloodline. Your job is to heal yourself and hopefully give someone a blueprint to look at. Say, she doesn't function the way I've observed our family function before. There's something healthy about the way she moves. I like that. It feels good. It feels peaceful. It feels healed. I need to experience that in my life. I might need to call her, or I might just need to pay close attention to what she's doing. Because she's demonstrating something that I aspire to. That's the anatomy of generational healing, people. Yes, ma'am. Because just like you have come into generational dysfunction by proximity and by observation and by experience and by influence, generational healing is the same way. Generational blessings are the same way. And if there are children in your family and they feel more peaceful around you, trust me when I say you're helping their little brains heal. So that's it. That's what I wanted to share with you today. I wanted to talk about this generational dysfunctional thing as a pattern and talk about the anatomy of it so you can begin to look forward at it, not just from a spiritual perspective of needing to pray for it to be lifted, but understanding there are things that you can do with intent, starting with making the assumption, if you come from generational dysfunction, there can't all be victims and no perpetrators. There's a good chance that your brain as a child was highly influenced. Your cognition was influenced to place you in a position to become a part of that dysfunctional machinery. You just have to assume it. You know how you experience life. No one walks away from dysfunction unharmed. No one. You have to assume you didn't. And get in there and really start digging in the dark places and seeing where all the skeletons are hiding. Looking in the blind spots and seeing where you're reacting to life as a pain or a trauma response. That's causing you to bleed on others in ways that you're not even aware of. Consider the anatomy of that thing. And I'll talk to you next time. I really hope you enjoyed this original, raw first look into my thoughts about the anatomy of generational curses, which I call generational dysfunction. I am going to be covering this topic for some time now, probably until I take my last breath. And if there's any possibility after that, child. Okay. You can always find me at hawabond.com, HAWABOND. It's the home of this podcast, even though you can find me on Spotify, you can find it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts. But you can also go to the website to follow my 1-year challenge. Oh, that's a fun one. You just have to go there and find out what that's all about. Like I said, always reach out to me. You can even find out how to work with me one-on-one if you could use an angel on your team as you're trying to navigate your way through some of life's challenges, especially those associated with family dysfunction, family relationships, and all that fun stuff. All right, I'll see you next time.